What if the thing you call financial stability is actually one of the most fragile arrangements you've ever made? Not in an alarming way, just honestly. Because there's a version of a comfortable, stable-looking life that is, underneath the surface, one interruption away from significant difficulty. And by the end of this video, you're going to see your financial life not as a series of numbers, but as a structure. Once you see the structure clearly, you understand exactly where it's strong, where it's fragile, and what it would actually take to build something more resilient. Stay with this until the end, because the final realization is the part that genuinely changes how you think about work, money, and the life you're building around both. Imagine someone doing well by most measures. A good job, a reliable salary, a life with rhythm and routine. The money arrives, the bills go out, the weekends happen, and life continues. There's nothing dramatic here. No visible crisis. Just a person doing what most people do. Working, earning, spending, repeating. From the outside, and even from the inside, this looks like stability. But underneath that rhythm, almost everything in this person's life, the home, the car, the food, the way each month unfolds is entirely funded by one thing continuing to happen. One employer continuing to want them. One salary continuing to arrive. And that single thread is holding up nearly everything. The core issue is not how much you earn. That's where most financial conversations go. Earn more, grow your income, reach the next level. And while earning more is never irrelevant, it is not the point. The actual issue is how much your life depends on that earning continuing without interruption, because dependency and income level are two separate things entirely. There are people earning very well who are deeply dependent, and there are people earning modestly who have constructed genuine flexibility for themselves. The number matters far less than the structure it sits inside. When we call someone financially stable, we usually mean their income is consistent. But that describes only one half of the equation. The other half is, what does the rest of the structure do if that income stops? In most cases, the honest answer is that it begins to fail almost immediately. Not because the person made bad decisions, but because the entire architecture of their life was built around one assumption, that the income would keep arriving, and no one ever really questioned that assumption out loud. Understanding how this dependency works is important, because it's rarely obvious when you're living inside it. When income arrives regularly, your mind calibrates to it naturally. You find a home your salary supports, a car that fits the monthly payment your income allows. Habits form around what feels reasonable, given what you earn. And individually, every one of those decisions makes sense. But collectively, you've built a life that requires your current income simply to function. Not to grow, not to thrive, to function. Fixed expenses are the most visible layer. Rent, mortgage, car payments, loan repayments. These commitments exist regardless of your circumstances. They don't adjust when things become difficult. Then there's the variable spending, which in practice is rarely as variable as we assume. Most people have a fairly consistent monthly spend shaped by habit, social environment, and a baseline sense of what normal looks like. And then there's the psychological layer, which is the hardest to see clearly. When you earn well and spend roughly in line with your earning, your lifestyle becomes your reference point. It becomes what normal feels like. Any interruption to income isn't just a financial event. It's a disruption to identity, to comfort, to a version of life you've grown accustomed to in ways that go far beyond money. This is why dependency feels normal. When everything is working, there's no signal that anything is wrong. Smooth running systems don't invite scrutiny. You don't examine the architecture of a house while the roof is holding. There is a different way to think about this, not about rejecting work or abandoning salary, but recognizing that a life can be structured differently. not around maximizing income, but around reducing dependency on any single source of it. Those two things sound similar, but they aren't. Maximizing income makes the thread stronger. Reducing dependency makes the structure less reliant on any single thread. And the second approach gives you something the first rarely does: the ability to function, adapt, and continue if something changes. The first thing worth understanding is the relationship between income and expenses, specifically the space between what you earn and what your life actually requires to run. Most people close that gap without realizing it. As income grows, so does the baseline of life. The apartment gets slightly nicer, the car slightly newer, the habits gradually shift upward. And this isn't vanity, it's human. But what you've done, without any single dramatic decision, is built a structure where any reduction in income is immediately felt everywhere, with no buffer and no room to breathe. Your financial floor, the minimum income your life requires to continue in a recognizable form, is one of the most important and least discussed numbers in personal finance. Building resilience means lowering that floor deliberately, not by diminishing your life, but by distinguishing clearly between what you genuinely value and what you've accumulated through habit, drift, or the ambient pressure of a culture that continuously redefines what enough looks like. There's also the question of where income comes from. When people hear multiple income streams, they often imagine side work, freelancing, or additional jobs, things that still require active time and energy, just spread across more places. But if all of your income requires your continuous presence, you're still deeply dependent. You've made the labor more varied, not the structure more resilient. What meaningfully changes the structure is having at least one income source that doesn't require your active time to continue functioning. Dividends, rental income, revenue from a product, licensing, the specific form matters less than the principle. Money that arrives even when you pause. Even a relatively modest stream of this kind changes how you relate to your primary salary. It means a portion of your life is funded regardless. And that changes everything about how much leverage any single employer or client has over your choices. Liquidity deserves its own mention here. There's a cultural tendency to equate visible assets with financial health, a home, a car, things that signal prosperity. But visible assets are often illiquid. They can't be converted quickly into money you can actually use. In a period of income disruption, what you need most is accessible cash. Money that can cover expenses this month, bridge a gap, and buy you time without forcing a drastic decision. A person who earns less but holds meaningful, accessible savings is structurally better positioned during an interruption than someone who earns far more but has everything tied up in assets they cannot quickly access. Life doesn't stay still. Jobs change, industries shift, health fluctuates, priorities evolve. The structure you build today needs to accommodate a future that will almost certainly look different from what you're currently imagining. This means valuing optionality, the ability to pause, transition, or change direction without requiring everything to collapse first. The ability to take different work for a period, relocate, care for someone, or simply stop and think. These aren't luxuries. They're things most people will need at some point. And whether they happen with grace or desperation depends almost entirely on what was built beforehand. Skills are part of this in a way that's often underappreciated. One of the things that makes income disruption genuinely frightening is uncertainty about recovery. Not knowing how quickly or easily income could return if a primary source disappeared. Someone with a narrow set of skills tied to a specific role is in a very different position from someone who has developed capabilities that translate across contexts. The ability to recover income through multiple plausible paths is itself a form of resilience. If recovery would be reasonably fast, an interruption is a difficult problem. If recovery is slow and uncertain, the same event becomes something far more destabilizing. It's worth understanding why this kind of dependency is so common. Modern financial systems are designed in large part to encourage exactly this arrangement. Credit is structured around income. Mortgage qualification is based on current earnings. The consumer economy is built on the expectation that people spend up to, and often beyond, their income level. When people are dependent on their salary to maintain their lifestyle, they become easier to retain, less willing to take risks, and more motivated to avoid disruption. Dependency, in many ways, serves other people's interests. Stability is also very easily mistaken for security. Stability means things are not currently disrupting. Security means you have the capacity to handle disruption if it comes. These are entirely different conditions. But when you're experiencing stability, it's genuinely difficult to feel the difference. Even people who understand all of this often resist changing their structure, not primarily out of laziness, but because the life they've built carries real identity and social meaning. Adjusting it can feel like a reduction of self, not just of spending. And the people around them are building similar structures, which makes the whole arrangement feel normal and reasonable rather than fragile. Dependency feels safe until it's tested. And most people discover the fragility of their structure at the worst possible moment to be discovering it. It's also worth acknowledging that not everyone carries the same level of exposure. Dual income households have redundancy built in. People with accumulated savings have a buffer that changes the calculus considerably. Those with low fixed obligations have flexibility others don't. The point isn't uniform alarm, it's honest assessment. Not assuming you're fine and not assuming you're vulnerable, but actually looking at what your structure requires and what it can genuinely withstand. Financial resilience is not about escaping work. Most people will work for most of their lives, and that is not a failure of financial design. What resilience is actually about is building a life that can continue, not perfectly, but continue, even if one source of income disappears. Where a job loss is a difficult problem rather than an existential one. Where a transition is an inconvenience rather than an impossibility. Where a period of rest or a reconsideration doesn't require dismantling everything. That kind of life isn't built by earning more alone. It's built by thinking clearly about structure, about what your life actually requires versus what it has accumulated along the way, about where flexibility lives and where rigidity has quietly settled in, about the difference between depending on a salary and simply choosing to earn one because the work is meaningful and the income is genuinely useful. Most people never consciously choose between those two relationships with their income. The dependent one simply becomes theirs by default. The resilient one has to be built with intention. And that intention starts not with a financial product or a side income, but with a clear and honest look at what your life is actually built on, and the quiet, deliberate work of making that foundation less narrow.